one, they run it. Oh, they got the ball.
Snap. The kick is no good.
Throws. Johnson's there. It is touchdown. Touchdown. Calvin Johnson.
Trying to stretch to the edge. What a hurdle by Johnson. Highlight reel touchdown.
He might score. Taylor, touchdown. 48 yards.
Don't sleep on those legs. Oh, he faked the slide. Sauce time. Pickett.
Leary's going to take a shot. Has a receiver. It is caught.
Week 1 began with NC State taking on Western Carolina in what was thought to be a very easy tune-up game for the Wolfpack before that big showdown next week against Tennessee Volunteers. But the Pack really struggled, and Western was leading for most of this game. Obviously, there are a lot of concerns now with the offensive running game and the defense. Now, Cade Fordham did have to sit out after a targeting call in the first quarter, which did have some impact on the defense, but overall not a very promising start for the Wolfpack. And like I said, you have that big game against Tennessee next week. You've got to perform way better if you want to keep up with them, much less beat them. Solid performance by Casey Concepcion, though, as he had 3 touchdowns, which was good enough to get him the ACC Receiver of the Week. And Waters did perform a lot better in the second half, getting those 2 touchdowns. In what was more of a defensive battle and a field goal fest, the North Carolina Tar Heels did eventually prevail over the Minnesota Golden Gophers in a very tough road game that had a lot of things factoring into it, including the rain, which made throwing the ball pretty hard that night. Amarian Hampton did have a solid day as the ground game was able to get going against the Minnesota defense. Unfortunately, you lost Max Johnson in this game, and the offense looked kind of sluggish and slow throughout the rest of the game after he went out with his leg injury, which we now know has sidelined him for the rest of the season. So going forward, it will be interesting to see how the Tar Heel offense adapts through the rest of their schedule. But obviously a good road win against a power conference opponent, and something that UNC will hopefully be able to build off of. Wake looked very solid against North Carolina A&T. They scored a lot of points both on offense, and they had a punt return for a touchdown. Overall, a very solid day for Bachmeier, Donovan Green, and DeMar Claiborne. A lot to be excited for Demon Deacon fans, and you have a really good matchup with Virginia next week that should be very entertaining. In the first game of the Manny Diaz era at Duke, Malik Murphy had a fairly accurate game passing-wise. He did have some drops, and his receivers will definitely have to work on that if Duke wants to go anywhere this year. The defense looked surprisingly really solid against Elon. Now, you can say, well, that's just Elon. But with the team that I had defensive line concerns about with all that they lost last year, they looked really solid, and they got a lot of sacks, a lot of pressure on the quarterback, and hopefully that's something that they can continue on throughout the year with facing ACC opponents. The offense did, like I said, they took a while to get going, but in the end, it was a solid win for Duke. One that got Manny Diaz off on the right foot rather than with a loss to an FCS opponent. In a very close and gut-wrenching game, the Stanford Cardinal nearly upset the TCU Horned Frogs in their first game as a member of the ACC. This game could have really gone either way. Stanford was up for a while and TCU had to claw back. If the defense had been a little bit stronger throughout the entirety of the game, or if the offense had been able to put up a few more points early in the second half, rather impressed at how Stanford performed in this game. Io Manor, particularly, he didn't have that solid of a game. It was really the rest of the offense that was able to produce all those points and those good drives that they were able to convert. And really, there's a lot to be excited for with Stanford. They can build off of this performance because even though TCU didn't have a great year last year, they still look like a pretty solid team. I don't know if they're going to compete for the Big 12, but definitely a good team to be in contention with if you're Stanford, especially from the year that you had last year. So a very, very interesting game. It was very exciting to watch, and it's just a shame that Stanford couldn't pull it out. This game was a solidification that Clemson cannot compete on the elite level anymore. Dabo, in his refusal to use the transfer portal and not liking NIL and having limited use of that, has caused Clemson to steadily fall over the past couple of years. And, you can look at the matchup that they had in 2021 against Georgia, where it was 10-3 at the beginning of the year, and they ended up going 10-3. And then you look at this game, and you really have to wonder, what's Clemson's record going to be at the end of the year? Because I definitely don't think it's going to be 10-3. It's probably going to be worse than that. It's probably going to be like 9-4, maybe even 8-5, because their offense doesn't look very good. The defensive line looks great, obviously, and we kind of knew that going into the season. I thought the secondary was going to be a little bit better, but they definitely got a little bit exposed during this game. And it's not like Georgia really has that elite of a receiving core. They just have really well-disciplined receivers that just run basic routes. And you left wide open receivers off of that. So really concerned, what happens when you play a team like NC State, who I know they had a rough go of it, but there are some really talented receivers on that team, and if you just get beat on basic routes like this, what's Casey Concepcion going to do to you? What's Wesley Grimes going to do to you? What's Justin Jolly going to do to you? How are you going to stop them? So a lot of concerning things for Clemson. How are you going to score points? Phil Maffa was good last year, but he had Will Shipley to go with him. This year, he doesn't really have a sidekick. So it's kind of all on him, and he's not going to be able to produce as much. He's still a very talented player, and he's still going to get his moments where he shines. But overall, a lot of really concerning things from Clemson. And I think they're really going to have to consider moving on from Dabo if things are going to continue like this. Virginia Tech, what in God's name did you do? After all that preseason hype, all the returning production, and this is what you do? You come out and lose to Vandy in what was basically a neutral site game because half the stadium was filled up with your fans. I mean, what an embarrassment to the conference, what an embarrassment to the football program. I can't believe that you hyped yourself up so much as being a contender in the ACC and you lost to what is probably the worst Power 4 team. This is practically taking you out of playoff contention with this loss. Thankfully, you can still win the ACC and make the playoff, but if you're losing to Vandy, then you're probably losing to a few other ACC teams. You're probably losing to Clemson. There's probably another team on your schedule that you're probably losing to. Maybe, I know I have you already losing to Miami, and with how they played, you're definitely losing to them. But yeah, not a very good look for Virginia Tech. Miami looks like the real deal. They've got, like I thought, a really good defense, and that offense was clicking this week against the Gators, and you absolutely blew them out of their own building. A very impressive performance for the Hurricanes in the Swamp, and one that really looks like they're the best team in the ACC. much to say here. Louisville started off their season with a really strong showing against Austin Peay. Very encouraging to see that they didn't start off the season with some jitters or some rust. They just came out and blew out a really easy opponent, which is what you want to do in these situations. And who knows, they could be looking at a repeat appearance in the ACC championship game. We don't really know because the opponent was Austin Peay. But again, they look really strong. They came out and get it running, which is always a good thing for a football program that's looking to be at the elite level. Pitt's offense looked very much improved from last year. They did struggle for a little bit with Kent State. The game was kind of close in the first half, but Pitt really pulled away in the second half. Holstein looked really, really good. He did have one interception though, but he also threw 3 touchdowns, which was good enough to earn him the ACC Rookie of the Week. I think that Pitt will definitely have a much better year than they did last year. They definitely look way more talented and way more put together already. Even though the opponent was Kent State, there's not a lot we can tell about how they're going to stack up to power competition. They take place in Cincinnati next week, so that'll be a very important game for them. It is on the road too, so that will tell you a lot about who Pitt is when it comes to playing better competition. But definitely a good start to the season, and if the Pitt offense performs like that for the rest of the year, they are going to exceed what I expected them to do this year. The Fran Brown era at Syracuse started off with a win against the Ohio Bobcats. It was a little close during the first 3/4 of the game, but Kyle McCord's 4 touchdown passes were too much for the Bobcats to overcome. The offense looked a little more in tune to start out the game than the defense, but once they tightened it up, it was a relatively comfortable win for the Orange. It was good to see Aronde Gadsden back playing football again. He is a phenomenal tight end, and not only in the ACC, but throughout all of college football. And then LaQuint Allen was kind of used as a receiver, not only as a running back, which is really interesting because although he's a phenomenal rusher, he had 1,000 yards last year throughout the season. Him being used in that versatile way is something to definitely look out for. And they've got a really big game against Georgia Tech next week. Obviously, the Jackets are now ranked, and you get them at home. Really big opportunity for Syracuse early in the season. The Golden Bears started off their first season in the ACC with a game that they really struggled to win against UC Davis. Jaden Ott didn't have a really good game. He really struggled to get a lot of yards. He did score a couple of touchdowns, but he only had 49 yards total. Really concerning for me as someone who didn't really believe in Cal in the first place. I thought they were going to be a little bit worse than what a lot of pundits thought. And while Mendoza did look pretty good, he was 15 of 22. He had a touchdown. He only had 158 yards, which wasn't very productive. And that's why this game was as close as it was for a long time. And I really think that when Cal ends up playing these teams, particularly on the road, like Pitt, more than ever, I think that Cal is losing that game to Pitt on the road. Now, when you have teams at home, you have a decent chance. I think you have a decent chance against Stanford still. Oregon State, maybe. NC State, we'll see. Miami, probably not. So you're probably in for a long season, Cal fans. And I thought the same thing about Stanford. I still think Stanford is going to have a really tough first season in the ACC. So this isn't me trying to say that Stanford looked amazing and you looked horrible. So now Stanford is going to have a more promising season than Cal. That's not what I'm saying. I think Stanford had a good performance against a power team. You had a really disappointing performance against a FCS team, and that causes concern for me. Tony Elliott's Wahoos finally got a opening season win against an FCS opponent in beating Richmond. They had a really solid game where they just came out and took care of business, which is really good for Virginia. This is something that they've been looking to do over the past few years. They had some really disappointing losses last year that were winnable games for them. And this is part of the Virginia project. Winning games like this, making it consistent, and just building and building and building towards being an actual competitor. And I think this is a really talented Virginia team. If you watch my season preview, you got some real weapons here. Colin Drea, he made some mistakes, but he was a really talented quarterback. I think you've got some really good defensive players that can make an impact and get stops. And you could be a really competitive team with this roster. The only real downside is that your schedule is incredibly tough with all the teams that you have to face. You still have Louisville on the schedule. Boston College looks pretty good this year. Clemson, obviously a very tough test, even with their downward trends. North Carolina, we'll see. Pitt, who knows? Notre Dame, obviously a very tough game. SMU could be really, really tough. And even your game next week against Wake, who knows? On the road, Wake's only favored by 2 points. I think it's a real toss-up game. Could go either way. But this is part of the Virginia rebuilding. Winning games like this consistently and just building and building and building towards being competitive. And you got off to the right start, and that's very, very important for Virginia. Georgia Tech had a very important win against Georgia State, and it showed that they can beat an opponent that they are heavily favored against. Against the spread, Georgia Tech had not been very good. They had even lost some games against Group of 5 opponents, and this was an important win for them to prove that they can win consistently. They beat Florida State, who at the time was a top 10 team. We'll get more into that later. But they had to prove that they could be consistent, that they can win a consistent basis on a weekly basis. They have a very important game against Syracuse, and that's kind of unfair. Every game that they play is important for them, because you can realistically go into the Notre Dame game undefeated, and that's huge for Georgia Tech, because that means that they're already going to be bowl eligible by October, which is huge. So you have to beat Syracuse, obviously. Very tough game in the Carrier Dome. Kyle McCord looks solid. They have a lot of offensive weapons with Arundel Gadsden, Quinn Allen. Then you play VMI at home. Obviously, I think that will be a much more comfortable win even than this game. Then you go on the road at Louisville. That's going to be a very tough game, no matter what. They look really solid. Then you play Duke, who looks shaky. We'll see how they improve from then on. Then you play North Carolina, and I think that's a winnable game. That's an opponent that you've done very well in the past 3 years. And then you would have the Notre Dame game. And if you win all those games up until that point, you'll be 7-0. So a lot of opportunity for Georgia Tech to grow into the national spotlight and get a lot of attention nationally. SMU followed up their struggle win against Nevada with a very comfortable win against Houston Christian. Not much to say other than that they looked a lot better. It was a significantly weaker opponent in Houston Christian, but still a blowout win is a good win, and SMU can move on and try and build off of this. Florida State is so broken from last year, not making the playoff, that they've already taken themselves out of playoff contention for this year and for the ACC championship game, because they're definitely going to have another loss in conference. It's probably at least going to be to Miami, so you're not making the ACC championship game, you're not making the playoff, and you might as well check out until next season, Seminole fans. I had a lot of confidence in Boston College this year. I had them at 8-4. I think they could be 9-3. Heck, they could even be 10-2 for all I know. They look like a really solid team. Then again, how bad is Florida State? You know, how does Florida State do against a team like Miami, or maybe even a team like Notre Dame, if you want to compare to them? But you know, Boston College looks really good. Thomas Castellanos, he had 3 touchdowns in this game. I think he had an argument to be the ACC quarterback of the week because he had a really good game. If BC was a little more aggressive, he probably would have had 4 or 5 touchdowns if they felt like they needed it. But they were in such control of the game that they didn't need to push the issue. So, yeah, a really impressive game. Trayshawn Ward and Robichaux, they absolutely dominated the game. They had, I think it was like 268 rushing yards. Really impressive game by the Eagles. This is exactly what I expected them to do with Bill O'Brien drawing up the offensive scheme in that NFL style. Really run heavy and limiting the turnovers. You know, they didn't have a turnover in this game, and they actually played complementary football where they got an interception off of DJ Uiagalelei and they turned it into points. I think this is something that we're going to see from BC all year, where Castellanos has, you know, sub 10 or maybe even 5 interceptions and puts up a lot of touchdowns with his legs and his arm. Obviously, I think it'll probably be more with his legs, just because when you get down in the red zone, you know, things happen with the tight constraints and him having to scramble and extend the play and break down the defense. But they're going to be a really exciting team to watch this year, if this is a hint of what's to come. And I think this is going to be a breakout year for Boston College. I'm really excited to see what they do. I'm really excited to see what they do against other top contenders in the ACC. You know, that Louisville game from the video that I made, top 10 in conference games, now seems a heck of a lot more important than I thought it was going to be, especially with this win. Really excited for the rest of the season.